So we've read the scripture already now, sort of. So we've talked about Naomi as kind of this female Job character who brings her doubts and her struggles with God to God in the story. And she learns that God is faithful to her. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit today in this chapter 3. But just to start out, I want to make a few notes as we look at the chapter. So one thing is that this book, because Naomi brings her doubts to God, she gives us permission to do so. So she gives us permission to come into this place of worship, to come into God's family with honesty, that we don't have to pretend we've got it all figured out. We don't have to put on our shiny faces to worship together, but we can come as we are, and we bring sometimes our joys, but also sometimes we bring our sorrows and our griefs. And so it's important to note in the story, as we talk about Naomi kind of moving from an inward, I think last time I talked about how Naomi kind of moved from an inward focus where the grief turns her inward to now in this chapter, she begins to think about what's best for Ruth, and she begins to turn outward. So God's faithfulness to her experience of God's faithfulness turns her outward to be able to then be faithful towards Ruth and look out for Ruth. But it's important to note in that, in the growth that's being experienced here, she doesn't lose the grief that she carries. This isn't a story that as if she gets over it and moves on with her life, but it's part of her and it changes her. So it's a story not of God fixing everything so much as it is of God making something new out of the tragedy. And so I think that's important for us to note that we can come with honesty and not expect that God is going to make it all completely go away and we're going to forget all the sorrows and the tragedies we've carried, but that he makes something new out of it as we journey with him through it. So this is a weird little story, right? And sometimes we read it as this love story between Boaz and Ruth, but I don't think it's a love story at all. I think it's important for us to notice some of what's happening here. So they're in an incredibly patriarchal culture, right? And so in this culture, Boaz is this man of incredible power. At the beginning of chapter 2, he's introduced as a man of standing, a hayil, this person who's a warrior, who's a powerful person in the culture. And one commentator I read pointed out that Boaz's grandfather was Nahshon, who was the third in command after Moses and Joshua. Thank you. So he comes from an incredibly powerful Israelite family. This is a wealthy landowner who would not have been some young eligible bachelor, but would have been a well-established older man who constantly refers to Ruth as daughter. He's a man of standing in the community. He's probably already married with children. This is a story of a man of incredible power who's encountering this young woman who's challenging the expectations of the time and asking for protection. And she's coming in with nothing to offer. She has no family to arrange a marriage for her. There's no men in the life to arrange a marriage. There's no brothers. There's no husband. There's no fathers to arrange a marriage for her. So now her and Naomi are just left completely vulnerable. In this culture as well, the women wouldn't normally inherit the land after the men die. So there's not an understanding that they're coming back to Elimelech's land and they've got resources. They're just incredibly impoverished and desperate. And so in that kind of situation, Naomi now is turning at the end of chapter 2. She's experienced God's provision for them as Boaz is incredibly generous in giving Ruth grain and allowing her to glean in the way that she's asked. She's basically asked, I think I covered that last time, but she's basically asked in chapter 2, not just, can I pick up the scraps so that we can just skim by, but she's asked, can I get enough food to feed us? And Boaz responds with this incredible generosity. So Naomi experiences that as an expression of God's faithfulness toward her. And now in chapter 3, she's changed by that experience of God's faithfulness. And now she's thinking about Ruth. And so she says, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." The word that's used there is where you will find rest, which goes back to chapter 1, where she's trying to send her daughters-in-law away, saying, "Go find husbands in whose homes you can find rest." She recognizes that she doesn't want Ruth to have the future that she has, a future of barrenness and loneliness and struggle. She wants her to find a home where she can find rest. She's starting to think of what's best for Naomi, for Ruth, even though it might cost her personally. Because Ruth is the one finding the grain. Ruth is the one taking care of Naomi. So for Ruth to go into a family and find rest does not necessarily mean that Naomi will continue to have someone to provide for her. So she's now turning to think about what's best for Ruth. And Ruth goes into this weird little situation where there's some kind of like sexual tension going on here, but the author is very respectful in talking about this. And part of what's going on here with this weird little story is that for Ruth coming in and basically proposing to Boaz, basically saying, "Boaz, will you take me as your wife?" In a situation where she has no one to arrange a marriage, she has no bride price or dowry to offer, she's coming in with nothing to offer, a poor, barren widow. She's basically saying, "Take me or leave me." And if he took her, he would consummate the marriage, and that's it. She's married. There's no ceremony, there's no wedding party. You just are either taking me or not. So she's putting herself in this incredibly vulnerable situation with Boaz, taking incredible risk, not knowing how he'll respond, but trusting because of how good he's been so far that he will respond graciously. So Ruth is this incredibly courageous character in this story. But not only that, when she encounters Boaz now, and Boaz wakes up and says, "Who's there?" And Naomi's scripted it all out. "Okay, you're going to ask him if he can marry, if he'll take you as his wife." And Naomi is just saying, like, he's our relative, he's been good to us, maybe he'll be kind and take you as a wife and you can find rest. That's all Naomi's thinking in this story. But Ruth has something else in mind. And so Ruth pulls in Israelite law when she asks for Boaz's help. And she responds, "Spread the corner of your garment over me," the wing of your garment, which connects us back to the wing of the Lord that she's finding shelter under. "Spread the corner of your garment over me. Spread your wing over me for protection, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." So there's two Israelite laws that are at work in this story, and they weren't always connected with each other. One is the Levirate law, which is when someone dies and they leave a widow, the brother is supposed to take the widow and have a child so that the family name gets carried on. That's the one law. The other law is the guardian redeemer law, where the land was supposed to stay in the family clan. So if somebody sells their land and they're not able to redeem it, to buy it back, then a relative would buy the land for them and make sure that it stays in the family. So two different laws, one to protect the legacy of the land, one to protect the legacy of the family name. Both different. Ruth puts them together in an incredible act of faith for a barren woman to say, "Marry me and take care of my family." And she's challenging Boaz, inviting Boaz to reinterpret Israelite law and putting these two laws together and saying, not only take me as a wife and take care of me, protect me, but take care of my mother-in-law, take care of my dead husband's legacy, take care of my dead father-in-law's legacy, make sure our family is protected and taken care of. She's inviting him to do something much, much more than just give her rest. And Boaz in this story responds faithfully, and you see in the next chapter all the lengths that he goes to make sure that this happens and that they're taken care of. And he treats her with respect and dignity and makes sure that her reputation is preserved in that evening moment, and sends her home with food as an assurance to Naomi that he's going to make sure that they're taken care of. So it's a cool little story, but it's a story that we learn more from, I think, when we acknowledge the power dynamics that are at work, the incredible risk that Ruth is taking, and also the incredible and faithful courage that Ruth has to challenge a man like this and to ask him to go beyond the minimum requirements of the law, to fulfill the heart of it. She's an outsider to Israel who's looking at it from a different perspective and saying, this is what it's supposed to do for us. This is what the law is supposed to provide. Will you do this for us? So there's 3 words that kind of are at play in this story. The first one is goel. And goel is the word for the family redeemer. So someone who can redeem one and restore them to wholeness. So this is that family redeemer law that I was talking about. So the goel would have a responsibility to perform redemption or restoration, but they weren't obligated to do so. And in this story, there's an apparent hierarchy of response. The closest relative has the first rights. So it indicates that there's volition, there's choice, there's determination involved. Thus, the goel must be willing to do the redemption. And this is a crucial aspect to the role or the function of the goel, which is often overlooked. And the same aspect of volition is at work in the Levirate marriage. So this role of the family redeemer is something that reflects God as the great kinsman redeemer that's seen in the Exodus. The one who redeems Israel, who rescues Israel, who restores them. And so the Israelites are called to do this. This law is put in place as a reflection of the kind of God that they have. I am the God who redeemed you out of slavery, who redeemed you out of Egypt. And now because I've redeemed you, now redeem your fellow man. And so the human goel, in a sense, is representing God's redeeming grace and faithfulness. In the book of Isaiah, actually, the word goel refers exclusively to Yahweh. It's a word that's often used of God himself as the great goel, the great redeemer. So Boaz, in taking on this role, is stepping in as a man of God, as one who is like God in doing the work, the kind of work that God does. The second word is the word hayil. And this is the word that's strength of character. So at the beginning of chapter 2, Boaz is introduced as a man of standing, a hayil, a gibor hayil. And one translator says this is, or one commentator says this word is difficult to translate into English, but it kind of has the connotation of like a mighty warrior. The word hayil can mean strength, power, ability, capability, wealth, and its meaning depends on the context that it's used in. So in a military setting, it would refer to a mighty warrior, one who's distinguished himself in combat. In other contexts, they can talk about wealth or ability, one who possesses social standing, a good reputation. And so in this context, it probably pulls a lot of those threads together. In this time, in the Judges, where Israel is establishing themselves in the land, for Boaz to be a hayil means that he's going to have all of that. He's going to have the wealth, the influence, the warrior stuff, all of it together, and status. The third word is chesed. And this is an incredibly important word in the Bible because it's the word that describes the covenant loyalty or the faithfulness, the kindness, the goodness of God, God's mercy, his love, his compassion. But it's a word that there's not a direct translation into English for it. There's not one English word or phrase that captures the breadth of the meaning of this one word. And so we can easily skim over references to chesed without realizing we've just stumbled over one of the most potent words in the Old Testament. It's the way that God intended human beings to live together from the beginning. The love your neighbor as yourself brand of living. An active, selfless, sacrificial caring for one another that goes against the grain of our fallen natures. So chesed is relational, it's generous, it's fundamentally an action, usually performed for the benefit of a person in need within the context of a deep and enduring commitment. So for Israel, who's in a covenant relationship with God, God is chesed toward them. God is faithful, he's generous, he's loving, taking care of them. It's primarily a characteristic of God. And over 2/3 of the words occurrences in the Bible are of God's chesed, God's faithfulness to humans. There's always two parties involved in chesed, someone in desperate need and a second person who possesses the power and the resources to make a difference. Chesed is driven by a loyal, selfless love that motivates a person to do voluntarily what no one has a right to expect or ask of them. It's the kind of love we find most fully expressed in Jesus. So you could say in a nutshell, chesed is the gospel lived out. So these three words, the Goel, the family redeemer, the Chayil, the man of standing, the Chesed, the faithful love of God, all play a part in this little story. So for Naomi, there's three characters at work here: Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. For Naomi, she begins empty, afflicted by the Almighty, questioning God's goodness. And then, as we've discussed already, her awareness of God's unfailing chesed, God's faithful love for her, breathes new life into her soul. And the Naomi we encounter after that, at the end of chapter 2, is no longer thinking of herself. She's focused on her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and so she becomes a chesed giver. And she ends at the end of chapter 4 with her arms full of hope and a future. Her heart is filled by God's chesed toward her. And baby Obed at the end, I'm combining a couple chapters here, which we haven't gotten to yet. But baby Obed, you can even see him as Naomi's Goel, Naomi's family redeemer, the one who will care for her in her old age. Ruth is described at the end of chapter 4 as better than 7 sons, better than the perfect number of sons. Her daughter-in-law, the Moabite, the widow, the barren one, is the ultimate fulfillment for a woman in a patriarchal home. For a woman in a patriarchal home, the ultimate fulfillment is sons, right? You need to have sons. You don't have any meaning or purpose or status in your community without sons. And Naomi has no more sons. And at the end of the story, it says, Ruth has been better to you than 7 sons. Ruth expresses chesed toward Naomi. And so by the end of the story, Naomi has a son, her emptiness is filled, God has been faithful to her. Ruth has difficult beginnings. As we've explored, she's poor, she's barren, and she has this remarkable conversion experience where she says, your God will be my God, your people will be my people. And she changes and she becomes this woman who's challenging the law, who's always looking at it from a different kind of perspective than all the Israelites who've grown up with these laws. So she comes into the field of Boaz and she says, don't just give me scraps, but feed me. I'm in need and we need food. And so she asks Boaz to get to the heart of the law and feed the poor. And then again in this marriage proposal bit, she's again challenging, don't just do the bare minimum and give me rest, but take care of my family and our heritage and our land and everything that's encompassed in that, and take care of us. Protect us. Be faithful toward us. And so Boaz describes her in chapter 3. He says, all the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. And there that word Chayil is used of Ruth. Boaz, the man of standing, says, you are a woman of standing. You are a Chayil. You are a person of character. So we see a story where Boaz grows as he's challenged by Ruth, and Ruth grows as she encounters this God that she's come to take as her own. So she encounters God's chesed. She encounters God's faithfulness in Boaz. And she becomes accepted and blessed by the community. And then she displays chesed. She displays God's faithfulness as a woman in God's image, caring for Naomi's needs above her own, often disobeying Naomi or bending the law a little bit, Naomi said, go home to your father's house and find a new husband. And she says, no. Can you imagine how remarkable that is for a young woman to say to her mother-in-law in a culture like that? She says, no, I'm going to stay with you, and your people will be mine. And then she challenges the wealthy landowner, feed us. And she goes through this incredible, risky marriage proposal saying, protect us, rescue us. Even to the point of having faith that she could bear a son again. This woman who's been barren for 10 years. What an incredible woman she is. And then Boaz. He's introduced as this towering figure, this man of standing. And then repeatedly displays chesed as a man in God's image. Protecting Ruth from abuse and harassment, providing for Ruth and Naomi's needs, using his power and his wealth to protect and provide, going beyond the minimum requirements of the law to fulfill the heart of it. And he responds to Ruth in this chapter that we're looking at today with integrity. He doesn't take advantage of her. He doesn't step ahead of his kinsman's rights. He makes sure that everything is done properly. He uses his power and his privilege for the benefit of those who don't have it. And again, goes beyond the minimum requirements of the law to fulfill the heart of it. And in the last chapter, we'll see next week, he deals with the business with integrity. He gathers the local elders, the people of influence, and sits them down at the place of business in the city gate and makes sure it's all done properly. He uses integrity and skill. He uses his influence and his power to influence the situation for the benefit of those that were powerless. So again and again in this story, we see God's faithfulness at work, but not only that, but God transforming people so that they are then able to be like God in being chesed givers and being people who are faithful and loving and generous. And all of them go through this process of growth. Naomi is growing in this story from a woman who's completely lost in her grief. Everything is bitter. God has afflicted me. And she's experiencing God's faithfulness, and it's changing her so she can be a chesed giver. And Ruth comes into the story as this young, barren, powerless woman who embraces the God of Israel and experiences his faithfulness, and then begins to express that faithful love, that chesed, toward her mother-in-law, toward her dead husband, toward her dead father-in-law. And Boaz, this incredibly powerful man, established in the people of Israel and obedient to the law, he's already letting people glean in his fields, right? He's already fulfilling the requirements of the law. But he encounters this young woman who has a completely different perspective on it. And he could respond as you or I might be tempted to do. I should maybe just say I might be tempted to do in a situation like that, to think scornfully, like, who are you? I'm the one who knows the law of Israel. I'm the one who's faithful to this law. I'm the one with the power and the influence. Who are you to tell me how I should be doing my job? But instead, he's gracious and he's generous and he grows in this story. He learns in this story, and he's moved by this incredible woman of standing that he encounters, this poor widow who he says is a Hayil, a powerful woman, a woman of standing, a woman with influence and with worth. He sees her for who she is rather than looking on the outside of what it looks like. So the challenge for us today is simply to be people who also experience God's faithfulness toward us and allow that to change us. Allow ourselves to be people who can grow, who can learn, who can be changed by the God that we encounter, to be chesed givers. To be people in our communities, in our families, in our relationships, in our workplaces, in our places of leisure and play, in every encounter that we have, that we are people who are giving faithful love away, who are open to the perspectives of others, who are ready to be generous, who are turning away from that self-centered kind of perspective to an others-centered kind of perspective. I think that's the work the Holy Spirit is doing in us, making us more like Jesus, the one who is the picture of God's chesed, the picture of God's faithful love toward us. And Jesus, God is revealed to us. And Jesus reveals to us a God that is others-oriented, who is always giving love away, giving himself away. And he calls us to be that kind of people. People who are giving ourselves away for the good of others. Sometimes it's costly. It cost Boaz to do this. It cost him financially. I don't know what other kinds of ways it might have cost him. It cost Ruth. There was incredible risk that she went into. So God's faithful love invites us to get at the heart of the law, the heart of who our God is and how he's calling us to be. Not the minimal requirements, not just good enough to be good enough, but what is the heart of it, of what our God is calling us to do and be as his people in this place. The book of Ruth, one commentator writes, beckons us to look beyond this remarkable trio of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz to Jesus, the perfect image of God, to make him our study, to imitate him. What did Jesus mean when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world"? How is his kingdom on a collision course with our own culture, with our own time? How does it challenge what we as Christians can so easily settle for in our own lives as good enough? If we make Jesus our focus and begin to embrace his heart for this world, we begin to act in chesed ways in our closest relationships, with our Christian brothers and sisters, with our neighbors, our colleagues, with people who are different from us. And when that happens, the commentator writes, the world will know that Jesus has come and that his kingdom is not of this world. Jesus, help us with this. Help us to be like you. Continue to change us by your Spirit so that we can express your love for our world, for our neighbors. We need your help. Thank you for your kindness to us. Amen.